Most people, I think, sort of come to hypnosis vis-a-vis this idea of the stage hypnosis. We all probably were in college or something when a hypnotist, quote unquote, came and put a bunch of people up on a stage and put them on a trance. And then within a short amount of time, after just being told to sleep deeply, now they're, raising their arms in these somnambulistic ways and, quacking like a chicken or whatever, singing Maria Callas arias in perfect pitch, even though they claim not to be able to sing at all. And it is kind of remarkable. These events are really, they're quite remarkable. They're disturbing in a lot of ways, but they also are sort of convincing in that understanding of belief and the power of belief, and that, like, well, if you believe that this is going to happen, then something will happen in a very short amount of time. But it certainly also shows that obedience is a troubling thing. It shows that the power of suggestion is really quite, quite easy to impart, and this idea of control. And so I think that hypnosis just gets such I feel icky. I don't call myself a hypnotist because I think it's just laden with a kind of history, which I'm going to actually go through a little bit with you. But it does kind of illustrate, or just culturally reinforces, this idea that the unconscious mind is this out of control, chaotic thing that is basically kind of running the show of our lives, and we need to exert some kind of power in order to get it under control. That whole logic, which I really reject on a lot of ways. So this idea of a binary, that we, the civilized, are in a battle with a much larger and wilder and a chaotic force. That's a real complexity with an either or kind of dynamic that does have certainly major social ramifications, making what is, quote unquote, other, that which is not I, something alien, something othered, that certainly perpetuates patriarchal, white supremacist, settler consciousness in all sorts of in all sorts of ways, which is a whole can of worms to open. And again, the fascinating history of hypnosis really is caught up in all of this. So I wanted to spend a little bit of time just unraveling that a little bit. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about me and where my practice is in relationship to this fraught history that I am holding, or I'm trying to hold in some way. And then, more importantly, as we move on, you'll leave tonight with something regarding what all of this can do for your own creative practice and your own life goals and changes that you yourself are embarking on personally. All right, so just to begin, we're going to go back to the Greeks. This is hypnos. So the way that this story is told, and it's been retold in all sorts of, through many centuries of human history, that in the beginning there was chaos. And that chaos isn't chaos as in cacophony, it's abyss or chasm or indeterminate void. Chaos is a genderless, primordial god who out of themselves gave birth to Nynx, night, and Erebus, darkness. And these are the great cosmic ancestors of all creation. And it is from Nynx that Hypnos, or sleep, is born. And Hypnos, the child of Nynx, grandchild of chaos, lives in an underground palace. He induces peace and rest on all things which are alive. So he puts us to sleep by flapping his wings, by waving a twig that he had dipped in the river Lethe, or distributing sleep-inducing drugs, which he carries around in a horn. And he's generally very benevolent. There's nothing more lovely than sleep, right? But in the Greek tradition, and this is just so interesting, thinking of Western civilization, the power of sleep also includes the power of death. His twin brother, is Thanatos, who is death, personification of death. That is his twin brother. So because sleep can inflict an eternal sleep, Hypnos is also feared, especially by other gods, i.e. Zeus. Now, of course, biologically, we could say, and hypnosis is a biological big conversation about biology that happens when we talk about hypnosis. Sleep and death are certainly created, are connected. I mean, what does happen when we lose consciousness? When the body keeps running, but the mind is somewhere else. But where is it? Is it alive? Are we alive? You know, the line between sleep and death, if you've ever had anesthesia, what the heck happened to me? So the line between sleep and death is easy to cross. And when we take the ability to inflict sleep on other sentient beings, we run the risk of abusing power. And Hypnos did. He inflicted eternal sleep on the boyfriend of Selene, the moon goddess, so that he could have her for himself. He killed her boyfriend. He also helped Dionysus lull nymphs to sleep in the woods so that he, Dionysus, could sneak up on them and rape them. So this kind of very early date rape seeding, planting of that seed coming from these powerful myths. And as we see in this slide, he was essentially Zeus's henchman. Zeus had to keep him under control. And in this slide, he's coming to take the body of Zeus's brother from the battlefield of the Trojan War so that he can have an appropriate burial. And if you know anything about Greek mythology, we know that Hypnos did not show up for Antigone, right? He did not show up for Antigone to help Antigone's brother who died in that same war, but in defiance of the tyrant, and did not receive a proper burial. So this idea of Hypnos, again, it's not all beautiful and amazing. There's a little bit of power play here that is not comfortable. Now, what's interesting about this to me is that sleep is personified as a deity in most human cultures as mysterious and divine. The realm of dreams is an altered state of consciousness where amazing things happen. Maurice Allais, the great anthropologist who really tracked all of this around the world, says that the cosmic sleep is just a part of this idea of mythologies coming from all of the cultures. So in Egypt, we have the gods Nut and Anubis, who watched over us while we were sleeping, protecting us from bad dreams, right? The Norse god Nox, a good god. Shiva, the Roman god Somnus, the Druids were really into sleep therapies. The Hindus and the yogis. So most personifications of sleep in terms of the rest of the world, i.e. the non-Western world, are not connected with death. They're connected with protection and the force of life itself, the healing force. So in this case, we have this beautiful representation. This is from one of the healing dream sleep temples that the Egyptians had, where you would go if you were feeling afflicted, you would go and you would receive dream therapy. The Greeks also had, this is this beautiful thing, the Ebers Papyrus, which is actually called the Book of Hearts. Ebers was just the guy who bought it. So we don't really want to name it after him. But this papyrus is this incredible book that was probably used in these beautiful dream sleep temples where we're really seeing how the therapy of sleep and hypnosis can just planting suggestions of healing, right, into the afflicted soul can help them to heal anything bad that is in this body of mine, in this flesh of mine, in these members of mine. May it now be expelled, right? May it now be expelled under the influence of God. That's powerful hypnosis, right? That's the origin of this idea of the hypnosis. The Greeks also, there's this beautiful text, the Asclepion of Epidaurus. Maybe some of you can pronounce this better than I. This is a text that does come from Greece. So in this place, this was a sanctuary, and there's a text that really describes exactly what they were doing in the temple in order to heal people. So here's a man whose fingers, and this is really interesting as we get into the history, a man whose fingers were paralyzed came for healing. And then you can see that he goes through the process, and when the day dawned, he walked out, right? Sound. So this, as Dannielle set it up for us, you know, there is this idea that you can go into this deep trance and you will emerge from that a changed soul. Something will have happened. Your paralyzed finger will no longer be paralyzed. Your paralysis around flying will be a little bit more easy. It will not be an affliction anymore. That's pretty powerful. But again, my whole thing is just with that power comes profound responsibility. And so I wanted to tell the story of hypnos and the uncomfortable lineage in that, in order to convey, again, this history of the power to induce sleep and how that was used and I think, you know, abused historically, because we're talking here about consent, right? So there's this idea when someone comes to you and they are wanting to have something change, that is consent. But in the case of Jean-Martin Charcot, who was the director of the Hôpital de la Salpêtrière in Paris, that's the hospital, and this is in the late 1800s. He is the father of neurology, right? So all of the medications that we have for depression and such coming out of this understanding that the brain and the chemistry of the brain is involved. But his main subjects, and he was experimenting on live bodies. These main subjects, often female patients, not always female, some of them were men, but they all had suffered physical and or mental trauma and were exhibiting what he labeled as hysteria. We think about Sigmund Freud and hysteria, but Charcot is the one who really coined the term because he was trying to isolate what's going on in this brain that's causing this these somatic kind of reactions of this hysterical person. So as you can see, he's putting these traumatized beings on display as they enter a deep somatic trance. He's using mesmerism, which is this idea that came from Antoine Mesmer from the 1700s about the magnetic pull within us toward the animal world. He's also using electricity. He's using lights. And in doing that, these traumatized bodies would shake, their eyes would roll back and around, strange voices and screams would come out of them. They would often rip off their clothes. They would move in sexually provocative ways. And obviously, this is a time of deep taboos around expressions of female sexuality. And so when we're exhibiting that through this lens, it just becomes really, you know, fraught as a history. And these were all documented by a photographer named Paul Rengard. And there's a trauma porn lens going on here. And I'm not showing those pictures here. But, and again, this isn't to say that Charcot, that neurology, that neuropathy, all of these things aren't scientifically super important to where we are in space and time. It's also really interesting to note that Sigmund Freud did study with Charcot between 1885 and 1886. So Freud is young, the young Freud is Charcot's student. And of course, Freud then took up hysteria. He wrote a book on hysteria as this scientific problem, right? And so he, you know, because the whole thing is how are these patients exhibiting physical things that are happening physically in their bodies that are clearly not directly related to anything happening right now, right? So there's some memory that has been caught in the body that then is causing all of these reactions. And we can bring this through the hypnosis. And of course, the thing with Freud that was so interesting is that, you know, he came up with this whole idea of the seduction theory, in which he kind of blamed his patients for deceiving him, you know, not telling him about the origin of the trauma. And then he had to come up with another theory of fantasy in order to explain the development of their symptoms. And of course, he, as we know, he never really confronted the abusers, nor, of course, did he do anything to change socially the death drive in the men who were inflicting these abuses systemically on these bodies. So anyway, the whole thing is so interesting to think about hypnosis and hysteria as the foundation, right, of psychoanalysis, of therapy in general. And that's the whole psychological ecosystem of the 20th century that is wrapped up in that. And of course, then Freud rejected hypnosis later on. But anyway, that's another story. And here's just another picture of that. But this idea of the somatic effects, right? So I was saying hypnosis is a biological. It really is something that it's unfortunate that doctors don't take more seriously, because there's so much science around the biology of what happens. There are these somatic reactions that absolutely happen. And there's these different stages to hypnosis as we understand it. Let's see if I have that slide. So we begin with this idea of lethargy. That's when you see that idea, that pendulum thing, that's because you're just trying to induce sleeplessness. So the first thing that needs to happen is you need to become sleepy, right? You do need to feel a kind of lethargy, a kind of surrendering in that sense of the ego. And then after that, vis-a-vis these suggestions, comes a kind of catalepsy, which is a numbness of the arms or the numbness of the limbs. It's a kind of plasticky sort of feeling. The limbs feel extremely light. That's why you see people raise their arms up like this, or, and that's very strange when we think, again, historically, thinking about the Nazis and that horrible gesture. In what sense is that a son of, is that a catalepsy that's happening there? Anyway, that was a little aside, I apologize. But after that, we come to the somnambulism. That's the real thing. That's where you're like really with somebody. Their eyes are rolling around, their body may be contorting, you see twitching happening because the person is technically asleep, yet they are conscious, right? They're asleep, but conscious. So the body responds. The body is letting you know that, yes, we are now in conversation with the quote unquote unconscious mind, whatever that is. And then the other thing that can happen is just this idea of time, intense physical transformations over the course of an hour, but it feels like, only a minute has gone by. And I knew I had way too much material for you all, and I'm going to wrap this up because I know we want to get moving on with our evening. But I just want to say that for me, this idea of control and obedience and the surfacing of uncontrollable urges, the shucking of taboos, the coming into the body in the ways that defy the social order, only to be put back into the very social order that caused the problem in the first place, is revealing of a history that I'm conflicted about. I don't know exactly what to do with. But I do think that there's a choice in how we approach it. So I have this beautiful woman here who's one of Charcot's patients, and I just want to conjure up Bracha Edinger, who's a Lacanian analyst. And she really is working with this idea of the feminine as a gaze in and of itself. And this idea that we can utilize these therapies and these analysts for gendered female bodies or trans bodies, and even, of course, enlightened male bodies in new ways. And this beautiful quote that I just want to share with you, and then I'll close with just one more little paragraph. Her quote is, "There is a longing for the passage from non-life to life, where non-life does not equal death." So I think about the reclamation of hypnos in that way, right? So if a person calls a hypnotist with the idea of a stage show or a doctor who's going to fix them in their mind, then they will think that the doctor, the hypnotist, has some kind of power and that they can go into the trance and come out a completely different person. But this kind of expectation is based on a rejection of some part of yourself that you are deeming to be imperfect, right? This part of yourself that's not living up to society's demands, right? And in this way, we might say that the drive towards self-improvement is actually a drive toward death, not life, because it entails attention and energy focusing on all that is not right, all that's wrong, which isn't to say that change itself is death. Of course, that's not the case. Change is life. We're changing all the time. But there's a difference between changing some part of ourselves in a way that celebrates what Ettinger is calling co-emergence, that we're celebrating that which is emerging, the new non-smoking you, the new you who now effortlessly can fly on an airplane, the new you who effortlessly walks into your studio to paint, or that is no longer in all of that pain. It's not breaking away from an old consciousness and then suddenly taking on a new one. We don't reject the various multitudinous parts of ourselves. We come into radical acceptance of all the parts. And in that, maybe the utopic we won't reject all those who are not, quote unquote, like us, including plants and animals, distant, quote unquote, others, other nations, religions, the whole you are not I, so die, which is a psychological consciousness. So we don't treat the procrastinator in you, the doubter in you, the addict in you, the traumatized being in you. We're not trying to kill those parts, but to include them, to ask them to join with love and compassion, involving them, all the parts of yourself, in the process of change. And when we do that, Hypnos is not a God who has the power to kill, because there's nothing to kill, right? Because dehumanization begins with each of you no longer dehumanizing parts of your own psyche, parts of your own life. So I'm going to end with that psychoanalytic utopia of joining, not rejecting. And this, I feel, is a divine feminine energy coming forward to reclaim the history of hypnosis, return it to its much more benevolent origins as protection. So I'm going to stop my share, and thank you all so much for listening to me.
Great, thanks, Kay. That was amazing. The Greeks are so crazy. It's like you read these things and you're just like, wow, it's really amazing. So I know you have a lot of questions, and remember, we're going to get into our hands-on, part of the seminar for the second half. But I am going to do a little bit of a talk just showing you images, mostly artist images who've used trance in some ways. And let me say that no matter what mode you're coming in from, there's so much writing, obviously automatic writing and so forth. It's just harder to show. So I'm going to show you a lot of really incredible visual images, and I just kind of want you to let them wash over you. But remember that the mode underneath them is really what is at the core of what we're searching, is that this openness, this almost shamanistic portal that happens, this sense of flow, this sense of deepness, this liminal space that opens into your unconscious. Now, I know many of you are creatives in different ways, whether you're a therapist, a writer, an artist. And the lucky part of that is that we spend a lot of our day in somewhat of a trance in some ways. And you step into making something, or when you're working with someone, or you're teaching, or you're a therapist, when you're in that flow and in that deep sense of what you're doing, you know this experience. in some ways. You lose track of time. You get deeper into your unconscious, things open in different ways. So, you know, tonight, by the time you leave, we're going to have some hands-on ways for you to do that through the tarot and through meditations. But I'm going to begin my talk, and we will have time for questions after. And again, these are really just to, you know, enjoy them. I can send you out, you know, in the email. Oh, didn't work. Hang on. Don't look at my images. Want them to be a nice surprise. So again, why don't everyone just take a deep breath with me? Wonderful. So we're going to begin on artists and hypnosis. I say that in a very wide way, the same way I talk about tarot, that, you know, you can step into tarot in a way that is in a deep meditation. You can also enter it in a deep meditation that has kind of more magical connotations like mediumship and so forth. I think both of those things I would say also are for trance and hypnosis. So let's begin. And we'll begin at the beginning because why not? And we are in Lascaux here, and the Lascaux caves are over 6,000 figurines. There are abstract signs, human figurines, animals. And one of the most famous illustrations in Lascaux depicts a man with a bird's head who is perhaps a shaman who carried out rituals. And the recent studies around Lascaux suggest that there was ritualistic dancing that would include trance-inducing or dancing that would induce visions in some ways. Just show you a few other. There's the little bird man. I put him there for you. So moving along into tantric paintings in India and in Rajasthan, mostly during the 17th century. And these were really about inducing a deep sense of flow, meditation, and designed to really alter consciousness in some ways. I'll just show you a few other tantric drawings, mandalas, and yantras. Very similar, used in Buddhist and Hindu religions. I also just want to really, in a way, for you to notice the pathways through these. And I also wrote a meditation for you tonight using the tarot, where I'm going to lead you on a path. So many times you are walking through a labyrinth in certain ways, walking on a path. This week I taught a class on the blue moon. We talked about the blue moon card with the two pillars on the side, also as an entrance and a passageway. Very similar to a mandala, you know, or a space or a labyrinth or a maze that takes you as a portal to somewhere else to alter yourself. Moving on to the amazing Georgiana Houghton, who lived during the Victorian era. She worked in an automatic process. She claimed she was guided by her spirit guides. She developed this style, you know, many, many years before Kandinsky, Mondrian, many of these artists that we coin as the first abstract artists. And she described her practice as a direct way of contacting gods and her spirit gods. And this is Annie Besant, and Annie Besant collaborated with the occultist C.W. Ledbetter on a book called Thought Forms, that I'm sure some of you are familiar with. And Thought Forms, they were both leading occultists in the Theosophical movement. Thought Forms was found in Hilma af Klint's library, Kandinsky's library, many different abstract libraries. And the work on the right were drawings that came out of key points of thoughts. So there were key points in the quality of thought determines color, the nature of thought determines form, the definition of thought determines the clearness of the outline. So they were manifestations of meditations in many different ways, and really became hugely influential all the way through Europe and beyond. We get to, of course, incredible Hilma af Klint, who I always love to say, you know, this show became the most well-attended show in the Guggenheim's history, really changed the whole paradigm of how we thought of abstraction, how we thought of also the development really of trance, spirituality in artwork or creative work. And, you know, she completed every composition in 4 days, following instructions from her spirits, which were then documented in text. I know it makes me think I'm doing it wrong or something when I look at this. Like, I just should get the message from spirits and just, you know, make one of these every 4 days. But really, really incredible. Moving along to Madge Gill, who I hate to say the word outsider artist or self-taught artist. These are all problematic terms in a lot of ways, but Madge Gill created her works under the control of Minarest, who was her spirit guide. So also just these incredible, mesmerizing, and I think that's a really important word in here, intensely obsessive drawings. And any of you who've drawn like that or who have written like that know how that alters your conscious, almost like a repeating line or something, or all this cross-hatching in there. Moving along to the tarot a little bit, and this is Pamela Coleman Smith, who was a leading occultist in the Order of Golden Dawn, the Secret Society, but was also the illustrator and artist of the Rider-Waite-Smith deck, which is the most, you know, it's the most circulated deck in history. So when you pick up a deck, it is usually the Rider-Waite and I add Smith, as you will see it now. You know, this deck. And it was written by Pamela Coleman Smith. The interesting thing about this is this was really she writes about this as this was a job, right? So she was a designer. She actually complains about it, that she didn't get paid a lot of money. So it's kind of funny, but she was, and I think this is important for us to know, that she was like a very, they were practicing occultists. And in the Order of the Golden Dawn, which her and many other people were involved with, one of the rights to become an elevated magician was to create a tarot card, which I made my own deck at one point. I always find that very interesting. So again, and that includes for me going into a card and synthesizing all that information and creating kind of a new meaning for each one. So moving along to another deck. So this is the infamous Aleister Crowley, occultist. Teach 5 classes on him and talk about so many interesting and problematic and interesting things. And on the other side, you have Lady Frida Harris, both practicing occultists. Lady Frida Harris was an artist, was in the Order of the Golden Dawn, was also a practicing occultist, but interestingly was a philanthropist and funded the second most well-circulated deck in the history of tarot decks, which obviously there are thousands and thousands. And this is the Thoth deck, really beautiful. So she funded that, she illustrated it over a 5-year period. Very different from the Rider-Waite-Smith, less narrative, more abstract. There's some other differences in there. But the two leading decks, I will say, circulated were both illustrated by women. I'm going to show you 2 more, but before we also get there, I want to show you Emma Kunz, and Emma Kunz grew up in rural Switzerland. She worked as a naturopath. She worked with plants, minerals. She began drawing in her 40s by using a technique called radiesthsia. And radiesthsia used a pendulum. So interesting that Kay was talking about this kind of swinging back and forth. And she would ask the pendulum questions on how to create these divine lines and how to create these patterns. They're really incredible. Like, I just think these are so beautiful and just amazing. So moving along into, of course, when we think about hypnosis, the unconscious, we start thinking of, the surrealists in a lot of ways, Francis Picabia, another little bit of an outlier. And this is a painting, Olga, that represented this woman's inner states, as well as her third eye. And on the other side, we have Masson, which was an automatic drawing. It's incredible. This is 1924, right? It's 100 years ago, of really just using a free-flowing line, an automatic line of moving forth. And of course, you can do this in writing, as I'm sure many of you have as well. Oops. This is Agnes Pelton. And of course, the canon is kind of opened with mostly women artists who used trance, spiritualism, and so forth since the Helma af Klint exhibition. The Agnes Pelton had a retrospective show at the Whitney. She was part of a movement called the New Mexico Transcendentalists, which had about 5 really interesting artists in them. And she drew on techniques from Blavatsky, the Russian mystic and founder of the Theosophical Society, but also being in the desert together, a lot of them, and practicing a lot of kind of New Age practices and meditation. This is Ethel Colquhoun, and really incredible, a British English surrealist, finally has to show up at the Tate. They just acquired 5,000 of her works that were sitting in a storage room for the past 40 years. And again, used a lot of magic, trance, a lot of different things, like many of the surrealists. There's a book that just came out on sex magic, different diagrams by Amy Hale, great book. She also created, maybe not have, there it is, The Tarot as Color by Ethel Colquhoun, which was a very unconscious, painterly tarot deck. Really different, right, than all the decks that you have seen. This is another, we're going to call it outsider artist, but Anna Zemenakova, really interesting artist. She received her training in Europe. She was trained while listening to classical music to enter a trance-like state. And she began creating artwork as a form of therapy in midlife. I just want to say, I love that all these women started making these things in their 40s and 50s, like so many of them. Fascinating, right? So she drew inspiration from botanical forms, but she was not looking to document plants, right? She was looking at them, and I love this quote, as messengers of other worlds and projections of other levels of knowledge. So pretty amazing, really beautiful. Beautiful works. This is Lenore Tawney. She received her training in Chicago and also was a fiber and textile artist. Again, really from the outside, looking at these sculptures as sculptures, but she believed that each of these pieces had a certain life force and could be used as symbols to communicate from beyond. She maintained a very strong Buddhist practice. This is her in her studio. in Chicago in 1957. We're going through so much so quickly, so good, but just hang in there with me. So this is, of course, Leonora Carrington. I'm on a first name basis with her. Just call her like Leonora at this point. So again, another surrealist, English surrealist that immigrated to Mexico City. You know, she worked with Remedios Varo, who I'm sure many of you know as well. And again, I think the most interesting thing to know is that, again, they were practicing occultists. They practiced trance. They practiced witchcraft. They practiced meditation in a group. Actually, Alice Rahone as well, who's an American. So it was Alice Rahone, Remedios Varo, and Leonora Carrington. All three of them also midlife women and immigrants into Mexico City. And really worked together in a lot of ways and were friends. So also, I'm sure many of you, just show you a few pieces. This is Mujeres con Ciencia. This was a women's conference in Mexico City. It's very kind of esoteric, magical, trance-like imagery. These images of her tarot deck were found after her death and were published by Fulgo Press. This, of course, on the left side is the Hangman. Just, you know, beautiful. When Fulgo Press released them, it broke the internet like twice. I couldn't get it till the third round. I finally got a deck. So again, I think, you know, she really, in making these, it was not about creating a tarot deck. And her quote was that it was not for fortune telling, her deck. It was an aleatory method for accessing the poetics of the unconsciousness. And I'll just say that again because it's so beautiful. Her tarot deck was not for fortune telling. It was an aleatory method for accessing the poetics of the unconscious. So beautiful, such a beautiful deck. I really just recommend it. Moving on to a few more artists. This is Ghulam Rasool Santosh. And really, in a way, almost these neo-tantric painters doing deep meditations, going back to early tantric painting. These are from the 70s and 80s. There were a whole grouping of artists in India that were doing things. He was again, practitioner of meditation, of tantra, of yoga, and really used all that transcendent energy into paintings. And one more final note on a contemporary note is Matt Mullican. And Matt Mullican is a contemporary artist still alive and practicing since the 1970s. He's been known for his performances that he has conducted under hypnosis. During these performances, he channels an alter ego known as that person who displays completely erratic and almost disturbing behavior in all these. I think this is at the Whitney. And when he is released out of that trance, many of these drawings are shown. The name on the work of these pieces is called That Person. That's how it's kind of named. So in a way, separate from him. Very interesting. So again, I've shown you quite a wide range of artists, but I think, you know, again, the thread and the core is how to go in a way deeper and deeper into whatever you're practicing in a certain way to access things that maybe you wouldn't have access to, you know, beforehand, like Hilma or Georgiana or Matt. I don't know if you want to release this, but still really going deeper. And in a way, what's I think strikes me, and I'm gonna pause this right now, is the kind of ease in the way that people step into their work. So when you look at these incredibly complex Kunst drawings or things like that, they're incredibly intricate. Or the Hilma af Klint, incredibly, those paintings are like 8 feet. I make 8-foot paintings, so I know what it takes. It's very hard to do that. To do that in 4 days is incredible. So I think to have this ease in whatever you're doing is really, really beautiful and interesting to consider in all of this. It's
You were
always there.
supposed to remind me.
Thank you. So welcome to class. And so we're going to begin with our 2 mini lectures and then go into a series of meditations and so forth. So a big welcome. Thank you for introducing yourself. Great to see people. Okay, why don't you take it away?